While the American economy is down and the trade deficit with Japan remains high, and the pace of new Japanese investment in American real estate, financial institutions, and business generally is brisk. At every turn, it seems, we're outplanned, outproduced, some would say outfoxed, by nationals of a country that we once knew mainly for what was considered junky products and slavish imitation of Western culture. Obviously, those are no longer things that come to mind when you hear of Japanese industry and business. Yes, Japan is a full partner now, and in important respects, it's the world's leader in the newly globalized economic scene. And the media show our countrymen responding in a, well, perhaps traditional American way to this challenge from abroad. If you can't figure it out, bash it. But I think there is hope. Witness the widespread support being offered in the Pacific Northwest to a partial Japanese ownership of the Seattle Mariners Baseball Club, to name one highly visible example. But also witness the America-Japan Week celebration in May of this year, a huge cultural understanding celebration that's going to be co-sponsored by the state of Oregon and hosted by the city of Portland, among other areas in Oregon. So perhaps the Northwest is leading the nation into a new era beyond Japan bashing. When we look to Japan and the rest of the Far East as vital economic partners, different from us to be sure, but we hope understood by us, and we hope we could be understood by them. City Club is glad to welcome two speakers today who have outstanding knowledge of Japan-American business relations. Gil Latz is Associate Professor of Geography at Portland State University and Executive Director of Portland's International Trade Institute. Dr. Latz has lived and studied for several years in Japan, is fluent in Japanese, is a board member of the Japan-America Society of Oregon, and is an advisor to the Urban Economic Research Institute in Tokyo. Our other speaker, Sully Taylor, is Assistant Professor of International Management at Portland State. She too has lived in Japan for several years. One especially interesting part of Dr. Taylor's present work is a study of how Japanese managers in the United States can become more cross-culturally sensitive to the ways of the American workers who they now manage. We're sure to learn quite a bit from our speakers today, so get your questions ready, and please join me in welcoming the first speaker today, Dr. Sully Taylor.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Mr. Wentworth. It's certainly a pleasure for Dr. Latz and for me to be here today and to talk to you about the recent increase in Japan bashing. I think we're all aware of the increasing acrimony in the U.S. Japan relationship, as evidenced by remarks by the Japanese Prime Minister, by U.S. businessmen, and is bound to ask herself just how much truth there is. Realistically, Gil and I cannot get at the truth today in our talk, nor, actually, do I really think it is possible to arrive at any objective truth, no matter how hard we labor at it. However, we can perhaps provide some thoughts that will be of use to you in sorting out this situation. What Dr. Latz and I would like to do today is to look at the conflict in the U.S.-Japan relationship using a framework borrowed from communication. What we hope to do here is to help us get beyond the rhetoric and the passions it engenders so that the real problems in the relationship can be examined with greater objectivity. We feel that the rhetoric and passions are occurring on both sides of the Pacific, and will argue that in addition to the U.S. going beyond Japan bashing, Japan must go beyond America bashing in order for effective solutions to be found. I will first look at the communication between Japan and the U.S. on a social or societal level, how our actions as people are perceived by those in the other country. And then Dr. Latz will look at the political level and how political actions are also influenced by our misperceptions. Let me begin by saying that the U.S.-Japan relationship is a cross-cultural relationship, and the people who are interpreting the actions of the other are culture-bound spokesmen who are affected by their own culture-bound perceptions. Let me develop this idea of perception a little. When two people from different cultures interact, their communication can be negatively affected by three things: misperception, misinterpretation, and misevaluation. Misperception is when we perceive things that aren't there or don't perceive things that are. For example, if you give Mexican children a tachoscopic picture with both a bullfight and a baseball game, they will only remember the bullfight. And when you give the same thing to American children, they will remember only the baseball game. Our culture leads us to expect to see or to not see certain things, and so we just plain misperceive in cross-cultural situations. Equally serious is misinterpretation. Perhaps I see a person doing something that seems like a familiar activity in the other culture, but it turns out that in fact my interpretation is wrong. For example, when speaking with a Japanese person, there may be frequent, long periods of silence within the conversation. For the American, these long silences can signal that the Japanese is through with his conversational turn, or he's bored, or he's not interested in communicating with the American. However, the fact is that lapses of up to 7 seconds are completely acceptable in Japanese conversations as compared to the 3-second limit in American conversation. When we interpret the long silences the same way we would with an American, we are making a mistake. Finally, even if we perceive correctly and interpret correctly, we are still liable to misevaluate. An American visiting a Japanese male colleague at his home, a rather unusual event, but it does happen, may not see his wife except when she is serving food and drink, and evaluate this behavior as subservient rather than as an expression of hospitality. All three of these problems, misperception, misinterpretation, misevaluation, pervade the remarks made by spokesmen on both sides of the Pacific, as well as the writings of the various commentators. I would like to take a few of these comments and look at them more closely to see how they reflect the miscommunication problems I have described. Recently, as you know, the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Miyazawa, was reported as saying that Americans lack a work ethic. This remark is similar to others we have heard from Japanese government officials, such as those by Mr. Shinohara in his book, The Japan That Can Say No, or Prime Minister Nakasone a few years ago. We are seen as lazy by the Japanese, although I should add that many Japanese managers who have spent time in the United States do not share this view. And yet, as many of you who work 50, 60, 70 hours a week and raise a family and are involved in community service well know, such a characterization of Americans is a bit absurd. Why then do we seem lazy to the Japanese? I would maintain that a lot has to do with the misinterpretation and misevaluation of the Japanese of our American behavior with regard to work. For example, when Japanese hear that some American workers, and I emphasize some here, leave work at 5 regardless of whether there is a crisis at work or not, they interpret that as lazy. Or when they hear that Americans are very sticky about what they will and won't do on the job and don't go beyond their job descriptions, they again feel that this is too literal and inflexible and shows a lack of enthusiasm, which is equated with laziness. Or worse, when they contemplate how easily employees leave employers, they see this as selfish behavior, which is the way it would be evaluated in Japan. What is the assumption they are making? What is the cultural blinder? The problem is that Japanese assume that the American labor market operates as it does in Japan and fail to see that the behaviors of American workers are largely a result of the structure of that labor market. When I protect myself by doing what is in my job description and not straying over into your area, I am building my skills and expertise in a specific area so that, if it is necessary, I can sell a definable set of skills and expertise to another firm. If I simply do whatever is needed by my group, helping out my colleagues, agreeing to do tasks that are outside of my main job, Then I develop a hodgepodge of skills and knowledge that is idiosyncratic and of identifiable use only to the firm in which I'm presently working. American workers are likely to move from one firm to another several times in their careers, and in order to ensure a smooth transition, they must keep a focus on clearly identifiable tasks and develop their abilities to do those tasks. I'm not lazy when I refuse to take on an assignment outside of my job description, but rational. Let me put in parentheses here, I'm overstating the case a little bit, but to make a point. Mind, I'm not saying that the way the U.S. labor market functions is the most efficient in the global economy we are facing. I am simply pointing out the Japanese who hear of Americans who insist on clarity of job responsibilities may interpret this behavior as ungiving, lazy, inflexible, and their evaluation of the behavior is negative. There is an assumption that we face similar labor markets. That is simply not true. And these views become the basis for the kind of remark we heard from the Japanese Prime Minister recently, a remark based on a case of misperception and misevaluation. And the misevaluation leads to angry emotional response on our part, one that can result in dangerous behavior by individual Americans toward individual Japanese, as we have recently seen in the physical attacks on Japanese expatriates in Los Angeles. The same type of misperception and misevaluation exists on our side. In the U.S., there has been and continues to be a characterization of the Japanese as workaholics who slave away 12 hours a day or more at their jobs and often work weekends to boot. The common reaction among Americans is that such behavior is excessive and obviously detrimental to the health of the individual as well as to the individual's family. But are we seeing things correctly? We see Japanese at work, on the job, for long hours, and we assume that what they are doing is what we would be doing, working. We assume that they are engaged in the same work activities and giving the same intensity of effort. Is this assumption correct? Frankly, no. First of all, these long hours are mostly characteristic of the managerial ranks rather than shop floor workers who by and large put in fewer hours and moreover get paid for overtime. More importantly, our assumption about what the Japanese manager is doing is simply not correct. While the hours spent at work may be much longer, the actual tasks are different, as is the intensity of effort. The workday is broken up by frequent meetings with subordinates, with members of other departments, and with visitors from outside the firm, which frankly is what makes the long hours possible. Put on top of that the fact that a good deal of the emotional life of the manager is centered at work, and you begin to see how the experience of work is very different, and therefore our projections onto the Japanese scene are incorrect. Again, this is not to say that one approach to the concept of work is better than another, but rather that we must be careful in using our assumptions when we look at what is going on in another culture, lest we end up making misevaluations about it. Let me stop here and turn this over to Dr. Latz, who will look at the U.S. Japan political relationship and how our respective cultural misperceptions may be exacerbating an already difficult problem.
There's always a toss-up when you do these presentations in tandem as to who goes first, and I agreed to let Sully go first on the condition that she would let me tell the joke. So I'm going to break the cadence a little bit here and tell you a joke. Some of you may have heard this. It's attributed originally to Isaac Asimov, and it has a nice Japanese embellishment. I got it from a Japanese friend of mine. It goes something like this. And the joke has to do with assigning students, given that we're academics, this is entirely appropriate, students from different countries to write a report on elephants. And the German student in the class put out a 3-volume book with footnotes entitled A Philosophical Analysis of the Existence of Elephants. And the French student in the class put out a slim and graceful book entitled The Elephant in His Love Life. And the Englishman put out a heavily illustrated travel guide entitled Hunting Elephants in Deepest Africa. And of course you're wondering, what did the American do? Well, the American student put out an advertising brochure that said, "How to raise elephants in your backyard for fun and profit." Now, the amendment, this is a 20-year-old joke, and so it's been amended to fit contemporary times. The English student has been revised, and his title is no longer How to Hunt Elephants, but rather How to Enjoy a Safari Without Killing Elephants. Now, the question, though, of course, that we're here to discuss today has to do with Japan, and let me move into my presentation by observing what the Japanese student wrote, and I'm going to do it over a 10-year period of time. 10 years ago, the Japanese student would have written a report entitled A Comparative Analysis of Elephant Studies in Advanced Countries. And by 1988, the report would have been The Perception Gap Between Elephants and Japanese. Now remember, this comes from a Japanese friend of mine. I don't want there to be any misinterpretation. And then the 1992 version of this is What the Elephants Think of We Japanese. So the question of what the Japanese think of us and what we think of them, and this question of perception, is what I will now try to analyze, building on the introduction that Sully has made. It seems to me that Sully has clarified in her presentation that our perceptions of the world are bounded by the cultures we live in. As a result, cross-cultural communication and interaction are affected by varying degrees of misperception, misinterpretation, and misevaluation. Such misunderstandings are at the root of the U.S. Japan bashing that now strains the relationship. In my presentation, I want to concentrate on the consequences of these misunderstandings at the national and at the international level. Now, while there are many contentious issues that we might discuss, the trade deficit, foreign direct investment, autos and auto parts as part of the trade relationship, semiconductors, I would like to concentrate on just one, the American perception of the Japanese role in the Persian Gulf War of last year. The different ways Japan and the U.S. went about addressing how to deal with Iraq's threat to world order need to be understood better, particularly as these differences relate to how American perceptions of Japan were influenced by Japanese behavior. I would argue that Japan's failure to act decisively either for or against the Gulf War has contributed greatly to the escalation of Japan bashing in the United States and, by extension, American bashing in Japan. Many Americans watched with utter fascination and at times disbelief as Japan's political system attempted to come to terms with Iraqi aggression and the threat it represented not only to world order, but the steady supply of oil to the industrialized world, a resource of vital concern to the Japanese economy. In the end, Japanese political leadership was paralyzed, unable to commit military personnel even in a non-combat capacity. And in the view of one highly respected Japanese commentator, Yoichi Funabashi, in the moment of truth, Japan, an economic superpower, found itself merely an automatic teller machine and one that needed a kick before dispensing the cash. In a nutshell, the American reaction to this situation was this. Japan appeared to be unwilling to come to terms with its global responsibilities to protect the integrity of the interdependent trading system that has raised this particular country to great power status in the post-World War II era. In other words, Japan is seen as a freeloader, taking more than it gives, seemingly oblivious to the consequences of such apparently self-centered behavior. The fact that Japan contributed a whopping $13 billion to the Gulf War, more than any other non-Gulf country, and imposed a special tax on its populace to do so, does little to counterbalance the American assessment. The tensions this creates is manifested in the halls of Congress and is dutifully reported on an almost daily basis by the Japanese press. This conclusion about Japan's role or non-role in the Gulf War deserves careful analysis because it's wrong. It's critically wrong for two reasons. It is based on a contemporary perception of Japan that has been heavily influenced by our expectations regarding how the country ought to act given its economic superpower status, and it's also based on an ahistorical view of Japan. The nub of the issue is this. Is it that Japan is unwilling to come to terms with its global responsibilities, or that it's unable to do so? A view of Japan that places the country in historical and geographical context would substitute unable for unwilling, thereby suggesting the challenge facing Japan in the next decade, and perhaps re-emphasizing the special role the U.S. has to play in assisting Japan as it struggles to become both an economic and a political superpower. Let me explain what I mean. History and geography temper our expectations regarding how Japan ought to behave in 4 ways. First, let's keep in mind that Japan has had virtually no experience since the beginning of its modern era, from 1868, a short 125 years ago, in the exercise of global statecraft. That is, independent policy formulation which projects Japanese priorities regarding the resolution of political or economic conflicts in its own or other world regions. Second, the Japanese perceive themselves even today as a fragile superpower in spite of the fact that the decade after 1970 transformed the nation into an economic giant. This self-generated perception is a legacy of Japan's uniqueness as the only non-Western industrialized power, one that is accompanied by feelings of inferiority when the country compares itself to Western industrialized nations. This sense of insecurity is reinforced by the internal assessment that the Japanese archipelago is a notoriously dangerous place in terms of its potential for natural catastrophes, a place, furthermore, where domestic food and energy supplies cannot satisfy domestic demand. The third point, Japan is a country that has notoriously bad relations with its regional neighbors in Pacific Asia, stemming from its history of colonial domination of Korea and Taiwan, as well as the bitter enmity associated with military domination during the Great Pacific War. As a result, even the suggestion of rearmament in Japan draws an immediate protest from its regional neighbors. And fourth and finally, there is the legacy of trauma associated not only with Japan's defeat in World War II, but its rebirth during and after the American-led Allied occupation in the 1940s and 1950s. Of particular relevance to the Gulf War discussion is the imposition from this time of a war-renouncing constitution, which permits the creation only of a self-defense force. The political situation is further complicated by the fact that since 1989, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party has not had a majority in the upper Parliament House, where the decision to send troops must be made. The fact that the Liberal Democratic Party has been constrained from exercising decisive political leadership over the past few years is symptomatic of the larger issues revealed in this review of the background reasons for Japanese behavior during the Gulf crisis. In short, there is no substitute for seeing Japan in terms of its regional and historical context. As a country whose all-consuming priorities, at least in the last 40 years, have been focused on adaptation and catch-up. As a country almost exclusively focused on economic objectives. As a country adhering closely to the U.S. lead in an alliance against communism. And as a country where the majority abhors war, a memory linked to the bitter experience of a fascist state, as well as the continuing sensitivities of neighboring countries. Perhaps the most important point to keep in mind here is that the ambivalence of the population toward war appears to have much to do with domestic issues. There's a continuing fear in Japan that once Japanese military action is again legitimized, there is a potential of repeating the disastrous mistakes of the 1930s. Better, it would seem, from their point of view, to keep a lid on this particular Pandora's box. Now, what are the implications of this brief analysis to the U.S.-Japan relationship? In terms of Japan bashing, the U.S. must take stock of its anger. It appears to be based on the expectation that because Japan is an economic superpower, it necessarily follows that Japan ought to exercise geopolitical influence. When we arrive at this conclusion, it's important to remind ourselves that this is an American expectation based on an American definition of leadership. Such expectations stem from a set of experiences and a value system that are fundamentally different from Japan's. In terms of Japan's defensiveness about its ability to project geopolitical influence, we must give Japan credit for what it has and continues to do with respect to playing a role in world affairs, particularly recent efforts to increase overseas direct assistance and to address environmental issues, and the most interesting effort ongoing to be granted a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. And we must continue to urge Japan to do more as well. In those cases where Japan's efforts continue to be far out of sync with what we want or what we expect, it will also be important to keep in mind that Japanese behavior may represent less than what it is unwilling to do and more what it is, as of yet, unable to do. American leadership and tutelage clearly could be helpful in the effort to help Japan grow into a new role as a full-fledged participant in world affairs. The Japanese, of course, must assume the lion's share of the responsibility for problems its behavior generates in the world at large. One important step to be taken is to project a clear sense of what Japan stands for. To return for a moment to the observations of Mr. Funabashi, a world power is a power with commitment to others. The International Environmental Conference, by the way, taking place this week in Kyoto, is an important step in this respect. Japan has an enormous opportunity, again in partnership with the United States, to address and resolve pressing environmental issues around the world. This is something that Japan could clearly stand for. But unfortunately, the opposite trend may be occurring, wittingly or unwittingly, with the popular attention in Japan and abroad now being directed at Mr. Shinohara's The Japan That Can Say No, the book that Sully referred to earlier. While this theme is novel from a Japanese perspective, that Japan need not necessarily follow the lead of others, it sends nonetheless a signal about what the Japanese will not do, as opposed to what they will do as an economic superpower and as economic interaction across the face of the globe continues to increase. The negativity which now pervades Japan and U.S. bashing in each country is an important point to conclude with. When we bash each other, there may be some temporary relief from the tensions we feel at a personal or even a national level, but the implications for the future stability of the U.S.-Japan relationship are ominous indeed. Tensions will inevitably arise from the competitive natures of our respective societies because we both have a capacity to produce excellent products. But our community and national leaders have an obligation to remind us that each country has a stake in the success of the partnership. Together, we produce, Japan and the United States, 40% of the world's gross national product. Policies, programs, and attitudes that drive us apart would not seem to be in the best interests of either party. But Japanese have good reason to question American commitment to the relationship when CNN transmits for all the world to see American workers paying $1 to take a sledgehammer to Japanese-made cars, as happened recently in Ohio. And Americans have good reason to question Japanese commitment to the relationship when personal attacks on the workforce in the United States occur and when confusion reigns about Japanese commitment to world stability and improvement. In each case, the anger has reached counterproductive levels where people's actions suggest they have completely rejected any responsibility for resolving the problems that afflict the world's most significant economic and diplomatic relationship in the post-World War II era. The resolution to these problems will not be easy, but as we have suggested today, it is essential to reduce the emotionalism and political posturing now occurring. In its place, each country needs to sketch a vision of the partnership in the 21st century, one that admits from the outset that change will be slow, given our fundamentally different histories, values, and ways of perceiving each other. Japan and the United States need to recognize across the board that each is a stakeholder in the other's prosperity, in the achievement of respective national goals. Vindictive and offensive behavior by either party will not move us toward that goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gil, and thank you, Sully. The first question today, if you'd like to share Gil's microphone with him, or you can step to the main microphone if you prefer, Patty, first question is for Patty Beattie and our board host.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Sully and Gil. That was wonderful. And I have a lot of questions, but I am limited to one. And you talked about misperception, misinterpretation, and misevaluation. And you told us in sort of broad terms the kinds of things that Japan and America should move toward. Could you maybe give us an example of 2 or 3 things, concrete kinds of things that you would like to see happen to move this forward to more of a partnership?
I'm going to take a break. You go first.
Concrete things. Well, I guess in terms of I guess what my plea is a concrete action on the part of each individual as you are sorting out the information that comes into you about Japanese behavior or actions or responses to the United States, to basically pause and to think perhaps in terms of what we have said here today and other things that you know, to basically stop and ask yourself whether the way in which you are reacting to that piece of information is based on your own cultural background or is in fact a misinterpretation and a misevaluation. I realize that that's not a very concrete action. I guess the second concrete action that all of us can take is to simply learn more about Japan, because the more you know about how somebody else sees the world, about how they define these concepts, the better you are at reducing your own emotional reaction by seeing the world as they see it. It's a vague recommendation, but I think ultimately it's the only thing that, in my book, makes sense.
Well, I think I want to emphasize and reinforce what Sully has said. Let me give you some specific examples of what I think we're both trying to say here when we talk about specific things that we can each do as individuals, which will have a relationship upon how we look at the national situation and the international situation. I like to liken the U.S. Japan relationship to a personal or a human relationship. And if we have a misunderstanding with someone who we describe as a friend or as a partner, it's not generally acceptable behavior in the United States to beat up on that person as a way of getting that individual to do what we would like to see them do. I think most people would agree with that. The complication in the Japanese case, of course, is that the cross-cultural communication, as Sully indicated in her presentation, is just that, cross-cultural, and it has to do with countries communicating with each other, countries coming from very different backgrounds. And so we just don't know what is the appropriate behavior that we need to display in order to encourage the Japanese to move toward a commonly agreed upon goal. But that's the challenge, it seems to me. We need to put out on the table what our vision is for the 21st century in terms of this partnership, and we need to ask ourselves, divorced of emotional criticism, how we can both agree to move toward these goals. And I think that is indeed starting to happen. I think that some of the initiatives in those trade friction areas that are now going on both sides are important in this respect. But to finish this example with a very recent contradiction, when President Bush went to Japan, not only did that mission turn out to be at odds with a level-headed discussion about where we're headed, but those types of exchanges which occurred while he was there were lost in the emotional and political posturing that went on both by Mr. Iacocca and by some people in Congress. There were important agreements. Consul General Moriyama is in the audience today, and he and I have had several discussions about the global partnership agreements which were signed while President Bush was in Japan, which pledges Japan to work harder on resolving the trade imbalance, which identifies a partnership between the United States and Japan in terms of resolving certain types of human rights issues around the world and the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and environmental deterioration. I didn't see very much reporting about that in the American press. So we have to think about what are the means to a commonly agreed upon end. And we don't seem to do that as well when we're hot under the collar. And I think what we're trying to propose is that we look somewhat more objectively at the specific ways in which we can identify a goal and then chart a path and move toward it.
First question from the floor will be from Chuck Shattuck, member of the City Club's Business and Labor Standing Committee. And after Chuck's question, feel free to line up behind him at the microphone on the floor to ask your questions.
Thank you. My question's for Dr. Latz. This is 1992 and a political year in the United States. And as we all know, that playing on fears is equals votes and be easily transferred into votes. Already the voices are rising, and differently this year, Japan is playing a part in our political arena. After November, of course, everything is over, the shouting has died, and we all shake hands and make up. But does Japan understand our political system, and where will we be standing in their eyes come November?
No, that's an excellent question. I'm going to give you two different answers. On the one hand, Japan understands our political system very well. I understand how the lobbying system works. They understand the historical background to our principles of free trade. They are absolutely prodigious analyzers of the consumer market and what kinds of products we want to buy. They've worked very hard at that, and so an understanding of the political process would follow, I think, from how diligently they've studied us over the last four decades at the very least. On the other hand, I don't think that the Japanese understand the way in which the primary system operates in the U.S. Presidential election process. I'm not sure I understand it myself. And so the problem here is that when emotion is used to stereotype the Japanese, memories are very long. Memories are very long, for example, in the Oregon State Legislature, too. And I think that although people understand that there's a time and a place to joust, that can be misinterpreted in a cross-cultural situation. And so there is some worry, I think, that we both share regarding the bruises that may linger on for a long period of time after the political season is over. I'll give you one example of this. It's not a political example in the sense that you're describing it, but I think it fits well here. My own view is that some of these recent pronouncements by Mr. Miyazawa and Mr. Sakauchi, both elected political leaders in Japan, can be traced back to the Gulf War. That took place a year ago, and up to the Gulf War and then after it, every day practically there were criticisms reported in the Japanese press about American dissatisfaction with the Japanese position regarding the Gulf War, and why weren't the Japanese doing more, and why weren't they doing this, and why weren't they doing that. And I think that the anger they felt about our criticism festered underneath the surface, and then it eventually boiled over. And it boiled over not at the moment as it might have in the give and take of our political debate. It boiled over more than a year later. So those memories linger on, and they don't go away quickly. And so we have to start over again, and we have to dwell on the past in order to get up to the present and talk about the issues at hand. So again, I would say, as I indicated in the earlier question, our emotional reactions, characterized as bashing, are counterproductive in terms of whatever our goal is to improve the relationship. And so if we can separate that out, I think we'll be serving ourselves well.
Dr. Taylor, do you want to comment on that?
No.
Ted Kay, City Club member. Today the Oregonian carried a story about a new video game developed in Japan. It simulates the economic and political struggle between the U.S. and Japan. Japanese progress is measured by little hamburgers in North America turning into sushi. The game is called Japan Bashing, and it's expected to be very popular in Japan, and not yet, there are no plans to market it in the United States. Any comments on this, as what insights it gives us into Japan?
That they like games? Well, I think, yes, I think in a sense it does give us an indication of what's going on in Japan, that something that we haven't really talked about very much today, but we've been referring to obliquely perhaps, is the fact that within Japan itself now there is increasing dissatisfaction and hostility amongst the populace generally. I think there's a growing sense amongst both young people as well as middle-aged people that that maybe the relationship with the United States is not necessary, and perhaps I hesitate to use the word arrogance, but a confidence, if you will, that perhaps is reflected by this this wonderful game that has just been invented. It's the same trend as we see in this country. It's the same. It's reaction to a different thing. It's reaction to a different part of the conflict, but it's a worrisome part because what is happening is that within the populations of both countries, we are finding more and more moving away from each other rather than moving towards each other. For a long time, too, I think it's important to keep in mind that the major leaders in Japan were from the post-war period, and a lot of those people were, for example, educated by the Fulbright Commission here in the United States. There was a great well of appreciation upon which to draw in Japan. One of the things that is kind of worrisome as the younger generation takes over is that they don't have that well of appreciation. And their response to what they perceive as increasing, never-ending types of complaints from the United States, Japan-bashing kind of thing, is one of, well, maybe we don't need you. And unfortunately, I think that's what that game peaks at. I'm not saying this to everybody, but I think that's part of it.
Well, that's a very interesting analysis, and I concur. I would simply add to it that, as I tried to indicate in my presentation, there is a sense of insularity in Japan. I didn't use that word in particular, but I was trying to describe that Japan has not had a lot of experience in the world at large other than economic experience. And it's the superpower designation is very much an economic term, and it doesn't extend yet to the political sphere. And I think this game, in an interesting way, is an indication of this. I think it's fair to say, and I think most of my Japanese friends in the audience and elsewhere would agree, that Japan has not been as sensitive to the impact of its actions as it might be and as it needs to become. And I think the game is a symptom of that. Well, we can reduce this complicated discussion about how our activities affect the United States in economic or political or cultural terms to a game. And the partner here is really not that important. It's just what we gain in the process. It does not bode well for Japan's future, that kind of thinking, nor would it bode well if we were trying to make a generalization about the United States in terms of this post-Cold War era. So on the one hand, now that the Cold War is over, there has to be a major rethinking of U.S. relationships with all countries, in particular Japan. And we're struggling right now to define that new relationship. It has to move beyond simple economic definitions. Japan has to tell us what it stands for. We have to find a way to talk about these problems without deteriorating into an emotional tit-for-tat kind of exchange. But each country has a lot to learn here, and in this case, I think the Japanese are being naive if they look at the world through those purely economic blinders.
Don Wagner, member. At the moment, there is a very large trade imbalance between the two countries. If there were none, it could be that the bashing would go away. Now, at the moment, the Japanese have a number of markets where they honest-to-gosh period control. Thank you very much. And in some cases, we would have products in the United States which are not being given equal access in the market, or so it's alleged. Is there a problem with perception here? In other words, could you use some of your criteria? Because if the trade balance were, in fact, even, would you speak to those points, please?
Okay, I'll give a short answer and then let Gil give his perception of that, so to speak. I think what you have pointed out is a very crucial point, i.e., if there were no, let's put it a little bit, let me change it a little bit. What if the trade balance were with another country? Would we see the same kind of action? I think we would. Maybe not to the same degree. But I think to some degree what we are experiencing here is an historical accident, i.e. as the United States is moving out of its dominant position after World War II, which was an untenable position in the long run anyway, economically, and learning to share economic front runnership, as it were, with the rest of the world, we are bound to feel threatened and have some difficulty in making that adjustment. I think that's always true. So anybody who is in the front runnership with us is bound to come under some attack, because I think that's just a natural part of human nature. And in this case, it happened to be the Japanese. Now, the question that you've raised is really, I see, as two parts, i.e., is Japan exacerbating this sort of natural problem that would occur anyway by practices that are unfair and making it more difficult for American companies to really be competitive in the world market today? That would take a long time to answer. I don't think that any Japanese would deny that certainly in the post-World War period there were practices that were undertaken by the Japanese government and by Japanese businesses themselves that were not fair by the way we define the game. If you look at a lot of the developing nations in the world, Korea, Taiwan, etc., they are practicing pretty much the same practices as Japan. The fact is that most of the formal practices have disappeared. And when you look at tariffs, for example, Japan's tariffs are amongst the lowest in the world. So the formal barriers have disappeared, and what we've moved on to is the intangibles, the non-tariff barriers. They're, frankly, again, this would take a dissertation. It has taken dissertations. A very quick answer from my part is I think when you look at the overall evidence, if you really want to focus in on just Japan, which I think is a problem in and of itself, is that yes, Japan has unfair trade practices or unfair things that it is doing perhaps unfairly. But I think it's very important to separate out what are what I would call damaging unfair practices from alternative approaches to industrial organization. For example, we blamed the Japanese a great deal for the keiretsu, the network of companies. Is that really fair on our part, or is what is to keep us, in other words, from adopting the same kind of industrial organization? I think it's very important to separate out those kinds of practices, which I see as really choices that nations can make, versus practices that are perhaps detrimental to the world trading system. And I'll just finish this with saying that I think it's very important to not focus simply on Japan as practicing some unfair barriers or having some unfair barriers, but to make sure that we look around the world, including ourselves, because I think we have been developing more and more barriers over the last few years, and to make sure that we put that into the equation.
I'm sorry to say our time has expired, but I do again want to thank very much Dr. Gil Latz, Dr. Sully Taylor. You've given us some marvelous insights and much to think about. We're adjourned.